Today's session is organized by the Jindal India Institute. The Jindal India Institute is an independent and non-partisan strategic think tank initiative of the OP Jindal Global University, established on January 26 this year. JII aims to intellectually decolonize the study and depiction of India and spread global awareness about India's extraordinary accomplishments and potential in the 21st century. It aims to usher in a culture and practice of high-quality research, analysis, policy advocacy, and training that enable a self-defined and self-confident India to emerge as a world leader. A little bit about the book before we start with the discussion. In 1956, P.R. Ambedkar publicly converted to Buddhism, raising questions about his turn from constitutionalism to religion. The answer lies in Buddhism itself. In the late colonial era, the struggle to produce an appropriate Buddhism for a nation in the making reveals a secret history foundational to modern India. Thinkers, activists, reformers, pilgrims, and monks from around South, Southeast, and East Asia discussed universalism, nationalism, modernity, democracy, and caste radicalism, and advocated an India return to Buddhism and the Buddha. This book traces this genealogy through the Buddhist itineraries and political projects of figures like Anagarika Dharmapala, Swami Vivekanand, Rabindranath Tagore, Jawaharlal Nehru, Vinayak D. Savarkar, Ambedkar, to reveal how Buddhism emerged as democracy's Dhamma, the religion of democracy. I would now like to welcome Dr. Surendran, who will now deliver the opening remarks and start the discussion. Over to you, ma'am.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Jindal India Institute under Professor Shriram Chawla. I'm sad that he wasn't able to be here today, but I'm so excited to see other colleagues from JII. I'd like to thank Vanshika and Raghav and Kanak for organizing, and I'm sure there are other people at the back end too, so thank you all for organizing this talk today. And I'd like to thank, of course, Professor Hindol Sengupta, who's sort of swooped in and agreed to be a discussant, a little bit with some short notice. But I really look forward to your comments. I've used your work, and I haven't had the good fortune, as I said, of reading your latest work, but I'm looking forward to it. And of course, my old friend, Swati Chawla. Actually, if there are many mistakes in the book, I'm going to say they're all hers. No, they're not. But she's read some parts of it really closely, and those parts have really benefited from her eagle eye. So I'm so excited to hear her comments on the rest. Thank you to my students and to my fellow faculty members for coming. My husband has also made the trip today after many years to Jindal. Thank you, Avi, for coming. And so without further ado, let me just talk a little bit about the book in brief, because I know there are people here who wouldn't have read it. And I will try to stick to my time limit of 15 minutes or so. Is that okay, Vanshika? Okay, great. So this book is a genealogy of Buddhism in modern India. Now, my starting point for this genealogy was quite simple. If you ask any number of sort of fellow middle-class Indians what they understand of Buddhism, they will likely say the same things. It's about peace and non-violence and the middle path, and perhaps they'll say something nice about the Buddha. Perhaps they'll bring up a tranquil landscape that they associate with Buddhism. Maybe they'll think about Tibet or Sikkim or some mountainous region where they've experienced a Buddhist monastery. Maybe they'll bring up the Dalai Lama. Some of them might even bring up the historical example of the Buddha who attained enlightenment under the Bo tree, if they've been to the Mahabodhi temple. Some of them might talk about the Buddha as having rebelled against Brahmanical orthodoxy, if they remember anything of their school history textbooks. And yet, even a cursory glance at the historical materials from the colonial era, and certainly from India's post-independence era as well, will reveal a much more gritty story. Okay? Now, every Indologist of British or European extraction commented on Buddhism in the 19th or 20th century, and 20th century, I should say. Every major, minor, or aspiring political thinker and social activist of the colonial era in South Asia also commented on Buddhism. The Buddha and Buddhism actually seem to be everywhere, on the pages of the journals of antiquarian and religious societies, in newspapers of the time, in the book stands. The world's first publishing sensations in English had Buddhist themes, like Edwin Arnold's The Light of Asia, or James Hilton's The Lost Horizon on a place called Shangri-La. Buddhism was in museums. Every visitor to Calcutta's Indian Museum, had to pass through the reconstructed Barhut Stupa. The Archaeological Survey of India, according to one well-known scholar, was established to find Buddhist antiquities, many of which found their way into London museums. And of course, Buddhism is present in public discourse. They were not always, in these various discussants, were not always in agreement on what Buddhist history was about or what Buddhism meant for modern India. But there was clearly a fascination and absorption with Buddhism, and that's what I'm trying to make sense of in this book. There are significant works on what I call the British discovery of Buddhism. It's named after a particular book by Philip Almond. But there's very little on the broader South Asian engagement with it. Actually, there are a few recent books, but they're very, very recent. Now, this book performs three kinds of framings. First, I explore what I call the secret histories of religious universalism, modernity, nationalism, caste radicalism, and democracy. Quite a mouthful, I know. But I argue that Buddhism was a veiled element, to take from David McMahon, in the development of these ideas in South Asia. So this engagement with Buddhism was often deeply political. Second, I trace a kind of search in modern India for Buddhist community, international, national, regional, Dalit, and much more. Third, this engagement was not strictly an Indian one in the sense of that bounded national territory we now understand to be India, but in fact a broader South Asian phenomenon that drew into its ambit Buddhist communities much further afield in Japan, China, and Southeast Asia especially. In particular, I note that there was a kind of triangular trade in Buddhist people, ideas, and artifacts that emerged between the colonial cities of Calcutta, Rangoon, and Colombo across the warm waters of the Bay of Bengal. So I begin my story with the Sri Lankan Buddhist activist Anagarika Dharmapala, who I believe had a pivotal role to play in modern Indian Buddhism, even though he's better remembered as a founding father of Sri Lanka and as a Sinhala Buddhist exclusivist. Actually, he spent more than half of his adult life in India on a very different set of projects. Those projects included reviving Buddhism in the land of its birth, initiating Buddhist pilgrimage kind of for the first time, and forging an international Buddhist community around the control of the Mahabodhi temple in Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha is said to have attained enlightenment. To do this, he established the Mahabodhi Society in Calcutta in 1891. He relentlessly networked with Calcutta's leading lights, and he began a journal with a small but pretty influential circulation in 1892. He stationed monk volunteers wherever possible in the emerging sites of Buddhism, some of which was still being dug up in the 1890s and well into the 1920s, actually. And he traveled the Buddhist world repeatedly to publicize the Mahabodhi temple cause, and I'll explain that in a second, and rally the Buddhist world around it. The fight for the control of the Mahabodhi temple is one of the chief axes of this book. The temple had been in the control of a Shaivite sect for at least 200 years, probably more. No one had ever gotten in the way of this small but regular stream of Buddhist visitors who came from Burma and Southeast Asia and elsewhere in India and had been coming for several centuries. Okay? In 1895, Dharmapala enters the temple, places a Japanese Buddhist statue inside it, which is then unceremoniously thrown out by the head priest's men. He's known as the Mahant of the temple. What ensued was a 2-decade-long legal battle which Dharmapala lost, and a much longer battle for control of the temple's management, which involved Buddhist communities from Burma and Sri Lanka and elsewhere in the British Empire, and eventually the political heavyweights in the Indian National Congress, the Hindu Mahasabha, and the interim government of independent India in the late 1940s. So though Dharmapala lost the court cases, he was able to rally some support for his cause around Buddhist Asia, such that Nehru, as first Prime Minister, was regularly asked about the status of the temple when he traveled to those parts, on entirely other projects. Oops. In 1893, Dharmapala attended the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, which for us is better known, of course, as the place that gave India the figure of Swami Vivekananda. Both were friendly there and hopeful of a beneficial partnership. They were friendly with each other, that is. Both preached universalist, if muscular versions of their respective religions, and both are remembered similarly as founding fathers of their nations. For a time, they exchanged letters, and Dharmapala even defended Vivekananda in Calcutta when he came under attack in 1894 for his alleged dietary habits and other matters. The friendship endured for a few years till Vivekananda got word of the Mahabodhi temple case, after which he declared that Dharmapala should not involve himself in Indian matters. Importantly, both believed that their particular version of religion applied to all people. Vedanta, that was Vivekananda's faith, saw God in everything and everyone, and thus sought to help people realize their potential. While Buddhism preached a brotherhood of humankind, tolerance, and an ethic of what Dharmapala called spiritualized democracy. The parallels between the two in terms of religious universalism, community building, popularizing the idea of a renouncer ascetic, associating their version of religion with emerging nations, and their embrace of a kind of pan-Asianist thinking had lasting effects. In the case of Dharmapala and Buddhism, the tendency to see Buddhism as a kind of moral and ethical code, shorn of doctrinal dogmatism, opened up a space for a Buddhism with subversive and liberatory possibilities in the hands of a variety of thinkers and activists. In my book, I look at a number of people like the spy to Tibet Sharat Chandra Das, the first professor of Pali in India's first Pali department at Calcutta University, Beni Madhav Borua, the founder of the Indian Rationalist Society, S.C. Mukherjee, and of course Rabindranath Tagore, all of whom I suggest were examples of the diverse interests that the Bengali Bhadralok in particular showed in Buddhism. But these were well-known figures. In fact, there were a host of very ordinary pilgrims and monks from around the Buddhist world, especially Burma and Sri Lanka, who in their travels to and efforts at Buddhist pilgrimage sites really made that circuit a reality. Buddhist pilgrimage became incumbent on good Buddhists for the first time in the 20th century, largely because of the transport revolution, the publishing revolution, and the efforts of the Mahabodhi Society and Buddhist activists. By the 1920s, larger and larger numbers of pilgrims from Buddhist Asia began to arrive in Gaya, Sarnath, Lumbini, and Kushinagar, the sort of core four sites. And the Mahabodhi temple was key in promoting pilgrimage literature and guides for pilgrims and in setting up rest houses and providing facilities in these spots. In my book, I look at ordinary Burmese, Sri Lankan, Tibetan, and Japanese travelers to India who helped cement these sites into a Buddhist trail. The pilgrimages sometimes were also quite political. I mean, all pilgrimages are political, but some are more than others. And an example would be Tai Shi, the pilgrimage of Tai Shi, the Chinese Kuomintang leader and Buddhist monk who visited South Asia. He visited Burma, Sri Lanka, and India over the winter of 1939 and 1940, ostensibly on Buddhist pilgrimage, but also to meet Indian National Congress leaders and others to create a broader anti-Japanese front in China. We know that China at this point was most concerned by Japanese imperialism and that onslaught. Besides the circulation of people, the circulation of Buddhist artifacts is also key to this story. The Mahabodhi Society began to pressure the Victoria and Albert Museum for the return of the Sanchi relics from 1932 onwards. After much reluctance, the V&A did in fact agree to return these, but in 1939, by which time the war had broken out, and it took another 8 years for the relics to make that journey to South Asia. In 1947, the relics reached Colombo, where they stayed for some time. In January 1949, Jawaharlal Nehru received these relics, like the viceroys had done before him, in Calcutta, along with the then president of the Mahabodhi Society, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. And thereafter, he made a speech about India's Buddhist history and the silken ties of Buddhism that bonded Buddhist Asia with India. The relics then they had pretty epic travels. They went all over Southeast Asia. They were particularly enthusiastically met in Burma by the first prime minister there, U Nu, who believed Buddhism to be important to Burma's regeneration, but the post-colonial regeneration and post-war regeneration. But the relics also traveled all over the Buddhist Himalaya, revealing Nehru's commitment to the external and internal uses of relic diplomacy. In this period emerged a discourse of shared Buddhism, which prompted Asian Buddhists to take an interest in Indian Buddhist affairs and allowed post-independence leaders like Nehru and U Nu to forge new diplomatic relationships, at least ostensibly on Buddhism. I have many arguments about Nehru, but I'll only touch on one here, or one or two here. And that is his attempt to pose Buddhism as a civil religion for a new nation, reeling from the horrors of religious and political violence that accompanied the partition of 1947. It was no coincidence, therefore, that India's national symbols, including the Ashokan lions and the Dharma Chakra and the flag, are actually Buddhist-inspired. While moving the national flag resolution in the Constituent Assembly in July 1947, Nehru did not mention Buddhism, but instead eloquently portrayed the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, who allegedly gave up a career in war in order to forge an empire based on the principles of Buddhist nonviolence and harmony at the center. In fact, there is at this time a veritable cult of Ashoka among political statesmen, with one important dissenter, and that was, of course, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, who strongly felt that Ashokan nonviolence was just poor policy and a total breach of Indian history, as a result of which Indians were unable to meet the challenge of what he referred to as foreign invasion after foreign invasion. Okay? Savarkar, I'm happy to talk about this more later. Savarkar rejected Buddhism as a civil religion and instead focused on forging a nation as a militant Hindu political collective that in fact forgot or willfully forgot its Buddhist past. But it was not just at the level of varieties of nationalism that Buddhism was being discussed among Indian political activists. Buddhism also had an important place in anti-caste radicalism. Starting from Ayodhya Das, under whose aegis the first Dalit conversion to Buddhism took place in 1898, to Bodhanand Mahasthavir, who had connections with Swami Achyutanand and anti-caste in the United Provinces, which is today's Uttar Pradesh, roughly, to Pokala Lakshmi Narasu, or P. Lakshmi Narasu, who brought Buddhism, anti-caste, and democracy together in Madras, to Rahul Sankrityayan and Dharmanand Kosambi, with their interest in combining nationalism, socialism, and Buddhism. Buddhism was a looming presence in these intellectual horizons. And this, I argue, had a role to play in the landmark conversion of B.R. Ambedkar on 14th October 1956, mere months before his death. In 1948, Ambedkar had republished Narasu's most succinct statement on Buddhism and democracy. It was called The Essence of Buddhism, with his own preface, calling it the best book on Buddhism he had ever read. In the 1950s, he traveled around Buddhist South Asia, including Sri Lanka and Burma, multiple times to see Buddhism in practice and garner support for his future conversion efforts. In 1950, Ambedkar had published his first full essay on Buddhism in the Mahabodhi Society Journal, in which he argued that Buddhist Dhamma is the Pali word for dharma, essentially. Okay? The Buddhist Dhamma is a social philosophy, in contrast to Hindu Dharma, stressed equality. Hinduism failed the test, he argued, of moral religion through its negative effects on millions of people at the bottom of the caste hierarchy. Buddhism, on the other hand, placed the mind at the center of all action and interpretation. Next, he goes on to argue Buddhism emphasized personal conduct through self-culture and self-control. And finally, its goal was, and I think this was most important for him, karuna or maitri, or love and fellowship. So this was Ambedkar's ultimate utopian vision, that is a society in which love and fellowship presided, in which liberal ideas and democratic principles like upholding individualism, freedom, rights, reason, a foundation in a religion of principle on the one hand, while supporting socialist principles, especially equality in all realms of life. Ambedkar hoped that the Buddha's Dhamma would lead to a social and moral climate that would ensure true religion, that would in turn ensure true democracy. So his Buddhism was democracy's Dhamma. Now, after his conversion was conducted by the Burmese abbot of Kushinagar, U Chandramani, like all modern Buddhists, he went on pilgrimage to Gaya, Lumbini, Sarnath, and Kushinagar, where he reportedly knelt before the Buddha image with tears streaming down his eyes. His conversion proved liberatory for many, as chronicled by several Dalit writers, although there were also criticisms. At his conversion, he administered 22 oaths to his fellow converts in the crowd, which included giving up caste and Hindu gods. He also called upon converts to convert many others by administering Diksha and asking them to take refuge in the Buddha and his Dhamma. With this conversion, Buddhism had also found its political community, one that would demand rights and privileges of citizenship after an empowering conversion. I'm just heading into my last paragraph. In my final reflections in my book, I raise the question of why so much of colonial South Asia devolved into genocidal violence between religious and ethnic communities at the very moment of the birth of nations, or within the decades that followed that process. I don't have a final answer to this, but I do believe it's worth going back to Tagore and to Muhammad Iqbal even, who both argued at various times that there was no such thing as, that there was such a thing as true religion, or religion as a public good in the arena of spirit, morals, and ethics in a diverse society. To a great degree, we see the full gamut of possibilities in this prolific discourse on Buddhism in modern India. Thank you.
Before we go ahead with the discussion, I would like all three of you to kindly unwrap the book.
back to you.
I would like to request Dr. Chawla to please start with the discussion.
I should mention that Gitanjali has my copy of the book because I got it from Amazon before she got it from her publisher, a whole month and a half before. When I applied for the job at JGU, my professors at the University of Virginia told me that Gitanjali Surendran teaches there, and she's written a stellar dissertation on Buddhism in modern South Asia. So I have been actually a champion of this book long before this was a book, so I'm delighted to finally have 2 copies. That this book is published as part of the Cambridge University Press's South Asian Intellectual History series gives us a hint. It is, by its own admission, an intellectual genealogy of Buddhism in modern India, a task that is long overdue, for Buddhism has lagged behind Hinduism and Islam in historiography and also in social scientific scholarship more broadly. As Gitanjali briefly mentioned, the book joins a short, though growing list of works on the subject. Those of you who've read the book would recall that it references Nirupama Menon's Rao book called The Fractured Himalaya, India, Tibet, and China, and particularly the chapter on Buddha Jayanti celebrations as this mammoth exercise in regional diplomacy. Also in the list is Taylor Sherman's book on Nehru, which also has a chapter called The Myths of Hegemonic Secularism. And of course, Douglas Ober's work, particularly his recent book, Dust on the Throne, The Search for Buddhism in Modern India, which argues against most academic scholarship and popular memory that held that Buddhism had disappeared in India by the 13th or 14th century, and it is no longer relevant to anyone except small communities in the Himalaya, Ambedkarites, and exiled Tibetans. That Buddhism is the religion of tattered manuscripts and ancient ruins for scholarly study, but it's no longer a living, thriving tradition. So we now know, thanks to these scholars, present company included, that over millennia, Tibetan pilgrims, Newar Buddhists from the Kathmandu Valley, South Asian Buddhists from Myanmar and Thailand continued to make transcontinental pilgrimages to Bodh Gaya, Nalanda, and other Buddhist centers in India. Likewise, there were Indian Buddhist teachers, lay and monastic, in the Gangetic Plains and across South and Southeast East Asia, long after its supposed disappearance from the subcontinent. And also, as the book shows, the revival of Buddhist institutions in the colonial period was led as much by Indians and other Asians as it was by Europeans. So the book joins the emerging tradition that dismantles useful fictions and uncovers what Gyanendra Pandey has called unarchived histories. That is, histories which have been marginalized, ignored, disenfranchised, and pushed out of reference or recall. Or in Gitanjali's words, the struggle to produce an appropriate Buddhism for a modern India reveals a secret history. I was going to say sacred history, secret history undergirding the rise of the Republic itself. While less than 1% of India's population identified as Buddhist at the time of independence, and that this hasn't changed per the last census from 2011, Buddhism, as the book shows, greatly influenced key movements in modern India, such as those of religious reform, anti-caste activism, left movements, Nehruvian secular democracy, and even India's foreign policy and diplomacy. And it was, in turn, influenced by colonial modernity and the anti-colonial nationalist movement. The latter was, and I'm quoting, an important factor in the nationalization of Buddhism, which was plucked from universal ownership as a world religion and recast as a specifically Indian phenomenon. As an intellectual history, several chapters in the book focus on key figures, and Gitanjali has spoken about many of them. So Dharmapala, of course, who resolved to restore Bodh Gaya to its former status as a Buddhist holy site and return the Mahabodhi temple to Buddhist control in his interlocutory relationship with Swami Vivekanand, We also get a peek into visions of Pan-Asianisms and the various universalisms of the time, imperialism, modernism, and in their particular cases, also Buddhism and Hinduism. Gitanjali also shows how colonial educational institutions, the intellectuals they cultivated, and the efflorescence of printed texts fostered a culture of debate about a spiritualized modernity and eventually a spiritualized democracy, and spirited discussions on India's relationship with the world outside. So these are evidenced in the intellectual careers of Sarat Chandra Das, Beni Madhav Barua, Samir Chandra Mukherjee, and Tagore himself, and also in Buddhist anti-caste radicalism and socialism of Ayoti Thas, Bodhanand Mahastavir, Lakshmi Narasu, Dharmanand Kosambi, Rahul Sankritayan, and of course, Ambedkar. A key contention of the book is, and I'm quoting, Buddhism found its political community via B.R. Ambedkar's Dalit conversion. Ambedkar insisted that Buddhism was democracy's Dhamma, the very foundation and basis of political democracy and democratic social life in independent India. At the same time, and these are my favorite parts of the book, there was a very material side to Buddhism in this period. So we have fascinating stories that involve archaeologists, philologists, there are textual and linguistic trails, relics, artifacts, pilgrims, pilgrimage circuits, spies. The colonial and post-colonial states, many of you would know, use these relics for various kinds of soft diplomacy, an effort that is most visible in the 1950s with UNU and Nehru, as Gitanjali just mentioned, who deployed this relic diplomacy towards their internationalist and domestic goals. Now, among the three framings that Gitanjali mentioned, the last one is what I've found the most interesting, which is this isn't just an Indian story, it's a South Asian, or actually an Asian story, Southeast Asian, East Asian. And it moves between modern India and modern South Asia. So again, I'm quoting, Buddhism emerges in the rich field of exchange, activism, and ideation beyond what national histories contained within 20th century boundaries will have us believe. And there, I think, is the potential of the book and its relevance for us today. So Gitanjali talks about Nehru's remarks in Parliament just after the Dalai Lama's escape in 1959. But actually, just the day before, so the Dalai Lama reaches India on 31st March, but just the day before, Nehru points out in Parliament, he's asked this question, how many Indian Buddhist monks from Ladakh are in Tibet? And he says that it is common for Buddhist monks from Ladakh to travel to Lhasa for religious instruction. 4 head abbots from Leh were in Lhasa. And he says anywhere between 30 and 100 monks are in Tibet. He says, I'm unable to provide specific figures, and this is in the Lok Sabha, because they are not required to register. So Nehru says they just come and go and they don't report to us. So this is a history that is now forgotten. Gitanjali also talks about political Buddhism, and this is largely described in the book through the anti-caste movement in the last 2 chapters. But also, I think, in Sikkim and Bhutan and in their histories in the 1940s, and we've spoken about this, Sikkim and Bhutan both are considered and not considered, so it's complicated, as princely states. And they argue in the 1940s that they're actually not princely states. They should not be. They have nothing in common with what they call Indian India. And they distance themselves from India. They're worried that they would be considered as the other princely states and incorporated into the union. So they say, and it's interesting given the history of the Mahabodhi society and the fact you mentioned that Palden Thondup Namgyal, who's the Maharaja Kumar and the last Chogyal of Sikkim at the time that it becomes part of India, was also president of the Mahabodhi society. But it's interesting that Sikkim and Bhutan make the argument that we are neither Hindu nor Muslim, we are Buddhist. And therefore, we belong neither with India nor with Pakistan, that we need to preserve our Buddhist identity. And they say if pushed to the wall, we would say our allegiance is to our north, and of course they mean Tibet, and not to our south. So I think that too, when I was thinking about political Buddhism, and you talk about it in the context of Sri Lanka and Myanmar, but I was also thinking about it in the context of Sikkim and Bhutan. Um, you say how Buddhism is hidden in plain sight in India. So it's in the histories of Indian secularism, in our public histories, in parks, you mention in the conclusion, and of course, in the Ambedkarite struggle. So I just wanted to end with one anecdote and sort of reference to one current discussion, which I think the book can illuminate. So when I was reading about the ASI and this fascination with relics, I was reminded just last year in June, a man called Ram Vishal Paswan, who was an Ambedkarite who headed the Akhil Bharatiya Buddha Ambedkar Shiksha Evam Samaj Kalyan Samiti, long name, in the village of Koshambi in Uttar Pradesh. He finds that the Manrega laborers that he is supervising have stumbled upon some old pottery and bricks while digging a pond, and they discovered a 100 feet long and a 10 feet high brick wall, and the site included ancient baths, rooms, and Buddhist stupas. So he discusses with regional experts, and he's convinced that the site is more than 2,000 years old and belonged to either the Mauryan or the Shunga period. He writes to the ASI, the UP Archaeological Department, and the Chief Minister and the Prime Minister, asking for their intervention in ascertaining if these ruins have any archaeological value. The ASI and the State Archaeology Department conduct their own inspection, and they say that the ruins don't need conservation. He then approaches the Allahabad High Court with a writ petition asking them to notify the site and direct the district magistrate to carry out its maintenance. The UP government then informs the court that though the remains were ancient, they were not unique or uncommon in the region, and they didn't have the funds even for the sites that were important. So I was thinking how far we've come, from the time that you describe. And they say, how many sites will we conserve when every third village will have sites from the Mauryan or the Shunga periods? And the department then accuses Paswan of trying to garner publicity so that the government would develop roads in his village and beautify his village. And finally, I want to end with this idea of retrieving the memory of South Asia itself. So we get an account, for example, when you talk about the Dalai Lama's, the bits about Tibet, of India-China relations, the Asian Relations Conference, discussions with Chu Enlai, the fact that the invitations to Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama are routed through the Sikkimese Maharaja Kumar. And the book, of course, ends in 56 with Ambedkar's conversion, and that's also the year of the 2500th Buddha Jayanti. But I'm thinking now, this idea that this is not an Indian story, that it's a South Asian or a broadly Asian story, what can we learn from this today? So how do you see the geopolitical relevance of Buddhism in relations among South, Southeast, and East Asian nations today? So for example, now one of the urgent debates is on this issue of the Dalai Lama's reincarnation and its implications for India-China relations, China's control over Tibetan Buddhist monastic institutions, the recent turmoils in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, are just a few instances where we may draw lessons from the historical evidence that you present. So just one example here, despite periods of conflict in their long histories of interconnection, the Himalayan Buddhists from Ladakh to Tawang have made thousands of quotidian gestures of solidarity with Tibetans in exile. And recently, in December 2022, the Indian Himalayan Council of the Nalanda Buddhist tradition passed a resolution on the issue of the Dalai Lama's reincarnation, stating that the people of the Himalaya will never accept a candidate chosen by China for political ends, and they will denounce the move. And finally, in reading your conclusion, I was reminded of this recent debate between Happyman Jacob, who wrote this piece in Foreign Affairs titled The End of South Asia, a region in name only, and Kanak Mani Dikshit from Nepal. He had a trenchant response which was called Head in South Asian Sand. And he accuses Jacob as, he says that he's a representative of a powerful section of New Delhi academia, ouch, that defends and feeds off Indian exceptionalism, promoting a kind of Monroe doctrine for the subcontinent. So I want to end with Dikshit's provocation. How can regionalism be deemed a failure when it has not really been tried? So has it really been tried post 56, you think? And he says what we need is daring scholarship that seeks to overcome the tropes of ultranationalist thinking that have kept subcontinental camaraderie at bay, which is also reminds me of one of your chapter titles. So I think the book nudges us in that direction. Thanks again for having me, and I look forward to Hindol's remarks and all the questions from the audience.
When Shriram first told me that you were part of JGU, I'm quite recent in JGU. It's only my second month, and you had written this wonderful book, and I immediately was enthused to be part of this because I spent a lot of time last year in Mongolia making a film on a man called Kushag Bakula Rinpoche, who was India's ambassador to Mongolia for 10 long years. And as part of that, and I was reminded of that even today, because as part of that, I was there when something that you mentioned vividly in your book appeared in Mongolia again, which is the Buddha relics. And the Buddha relics, and India's making a real effort, not just to send the Buddha relics across Central Asia and other parts of the Buddhist world, so to speak, but also statues of Kushag Bakula Rinpoche, sponsored by the Indian government, are now being sent. The first one is coming up in Ladakh, in fact. I went to see that when I went to see the Spituk monastery of Kushag Bakula. And these statues are going to come up in various parts of Central Asia. Now, it's very interesting that decades after Nehru was handing over the relics of the Buddha to Shama Prasad Mukherjee, no less, head of the Mahabodhi Society, these relics are being used even today. They are being used to, in a sense, carve out India's response to what it sees as an overwhelming Chinese takeover of, perhaps we could call it, the idea of global Buddhism. And this is being countered. The relics are only one part of it. The statues are only one part of it. India, of course, started organizing the International Buddhist Summit. And now China has its own Buddhist Summit, which it launched this year. And to take off from what Swati was saying, perhaps this competition over Buddhism is far beyond even the quote-unquote South Asian region, so to speak. It truly has acquired global dimensions and today echoes in, if not great power politics, but at least aspiring great power politics. Right? And I find it very interesting that the Buddha relics, which were once sent across, as you write in your book, to further the cause of Nam, are today being sent across to, in a sense, flagpole the fact that this is ours as far as India is concerned. Now, Swati mentioned this entire thing about what will happen after His Holiness the Dalai Lama goes away, as it were. And of course, His Holiness has said that he will not be reborn, as it were, in China. He will be reborn somewhere else, and so on and so forth. So this debate that, in a sense, you give hands and legs to, is going to be with us for a very long time. And in fact, perhaps you might find yourself writing many more books and telling us many more things about this, right? And it is, and the other thing that, I mentioned the Bhadralok chapter, it occurred to me how even today it is such an elite project at a level, as it was in the time that you depict in your book. It is a project which is being used for not just nationalistic goals, but of course for elite goals, right? And this idea that India must own Buddhism as far as any nation or state can ever own a religion, has extremely powerful strategic dimensions today. Now, many would say, my Chinese scholar friends would say, well, does China own Buddhism at all, having spent so much of its history eliminating any sort of trace of any religion, not just Buddhism? And yet the Chinese have come to the conclusion that it's great for them to use Buddhism and own Buddhism, because Buddhism belongs to them, as it were. Right? And all the things, I'm taken back to your brilliant chapter on Vivekananda and Dharmapala, and I think the Indian vision focuses and zeroes on Vivekananda as a figure, and forgets that there were other people in the Parliament of Religions. And I think your book is an extremely deft reminder that there were other, perhaps equally important characters who also had journeys from the self to the nation, so to speak, right? Certainly Vivekananda's journey from the self to the nation, of course, important for many people. There are other dimensions which I found very, very interesting. The contestations at the very origin of the dialogue between Dharmapala and Vivekananda that you allude to and then develop further in the chapter, right up to Vivekananda's death and comments that Dharmapala made, I found fascinating because the echoes of those conversations are alive even today. Because even as India wishes to own, as it were, Buddhism, it is a prickly ownership, so to speak. It is an ownership that forces India, as far as the country is concerned, or at the very least Hindu-minded Indians, to confront certain aspects of their own history and perhaps their own contemporary culture that they perhaps would like to erase or at least, ignore. I don't think your book will allow us to, or allow them to do that. I think, again, that's another very powerful sort of intervention that your book makes. I think it also asks a very basic question, which I was just talking about a couple of minutes ago. Who owns Buddhism? And how is that ownership demonstrated or affected? Does the ownership come from the fact that the Mahabodhi temple is in a particular geography, or the relics of the Buddha are in a particular geography? Does that ownership come from the fact that His Holiness the Dalai Lama will be born somewhere? Does it come from the fact that the Karmapa Lama is somewhere else today? Is Dharmapala, and I think this is a subtle thread that moves through your book, is Dharmapala equally an Indian figure? And that question is, again, very, very relevant for us even today, as we contemplate a future when His Holiness the Dalai Lama perhaps will no longer be there. Now, Swati mentioned Myanmar and Sri Lanka, of course. They have provided us new dimensions of understanding this faith, as you say, which made so much of being quote-unquote peaceful. And we are now confronted with new ideas, which I think perhaps always emerge when nationalism and faith, in a sense, combine together, of what peaceful really means. And in what dimensions or in what geographical conditions or societal conditions could the acting of peace be affected, so to speak? Certainly, this is a question. This is a response. Many of the Myanmari monks, so to speak, would sort of respond to Western criticism of what's happening in their country by saying, well, peace under what circumstances? And there are many ways to look at it. This debate will perhaps go on and on. Certainly, I know Sri Lanka much more than I know Myanmar. But certainly in Sri Lanka, many of my Sinhalese friends would make similar arguments. Yes, Buddhism is peaceful, But what does that mean? What does it mean to be peaceful? In fact, when I was reading your book, I was reminded of an admiral of the Sri Lankan Navy who I was talking to a year ago, who was talking about the civil war and so on and so forth, who said, well, what does it mean to be peaceful as a Buddhist? Does it mean to ensure the furtherance of peace or to maintain what he called a fake peace? There is no answer. There is no easy answer to this question. Who among us would ever claim that we have an answer to this question? And certainly, he had the humility to say he didn't have an answer to that question. Right? And I think your book throws up all these wonderful questions of who owns what, even in very material terms. Who owns the Mahabodhi society? Who owns that temple? And we are still in India where we are still debating who owns which temple, who owns which shrine, who owns what land under what context. So these debates are so alive with us today, and therefore your intervention in these debates through this book is so utterly valuable and so powerful, at least to me. I was also thinking, while reading your book, I think Swati mentioned this allegiance to the North, right? Now, we are sitting here today even as Sonam Wangchuk has landed up in Delhi, right? And some of the most trenchant critics, as it were, of Sonam Wangchuk accuse him of having an quote-unquote allegiance to the North. Now, the fact that China is present in Ladakh in many ways is no secret. But does that mean every person making any intervention or any claim, humanitarian or otherwise, in Ladakh is necessarily someone who has an allegiance, so to speak, to the North? Is again a difficult question. And I think, your book throws up this question that as Dharmapala's life and work goes on, where is he raising his money from? What is he using his money towards? When you look at his history today, perhaps this fusing of his very bodily self with a nation, and as you point out in your book, a large portion of his life's work devoted to an entirely different cause, is something that I find really, really interesting and important. Finally, of course, the Ambedkarite vision is impossible not to talk about. Of course, those battles are alive with us again, even today. And many of, contemporary India's caste critics, so to speak, have much to say about Ambedkar's conversion and indeed what that conversion, that act of converting, has meant over the years and even in 2024. I think this book really needed to be written because I think we have developed ideas of nationalism only in certain directions. And I think this gives us an entirely new perspective. A perspective that doesn't, we always think of nationalisms and its contestations as perhaps from the television that we watch every night, as real contests. People must fight with one another and so on and so forth. But I think there are other kinds of contestations. Contestations that agree and disagree in a sort of kinetic way, so to speak. And I think when I read your chapter on Vivekananda and Dharmapala, and the way you explain how their own views modify and change and, agree and disagree, and depending on the audiences that they're speaking to, alter. It's something that we knew, people like, us who worked on Vivekananda. Vivekananda didn't speak of Ma Kali when he spoke to his American audiences, as an example, right? Vivekananda spoke about Ma Kali and Sri Ramakrishna's devotion to Ma Kali when he spoke to his Indian audiences. And I was reminded of that when you spoke about how Dharmapala is also, in a sense, crafting his message for different audiences. Here is this American benefactor from Honolulu who's giving him so much money. Then there are Indian wealthy people. Where are those Indian wealthy people? They are not all sort of Renaissance figures from Bengal. there are other kinds of Indian wealthy people who could give him money. And how he sort of, through his journal, which of course sometimes, as you pointed out, he says different things in his diary than his journal. It gives us a sense of the richness of the dialogue through which modern South Asia, so to speak, came about. And for that reason, among many, many others that I've noted, I think your book is a brilliant intervention. And thank you, Professor, for a wonderful work.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you, for your very rich comments. There's no way that I can possibly address them all. But a few things, on the prehistory of Buddhism, I think Doug is right. And I think there is a deep sense of that even in the 19th century. So when you look at some of the early Indological works, people like Harprasad Shastri and so on, I think there is this sense that there is an intellectual history to religion, and that Buddhism, like everything else, has mixed, it's modified, it's mutated, it's gone into various shapes, it appears in various places, and there's an attempt to then write that kind of intellectual history as well, and there is a rejection of that idea. So I think that some of the ideas, some of this is quite coterminous with this time as well, that, has Buddhism really disappeared? Can we not find it anthropologically? Is it only in Tibet and Nepal and China and elsewhere? Is it not among us as well? Where has it gone? And this happened with the plotting of the new academic histories, I think, and in these new departments. So Calcutta University, I think, must have been an extremely heady space in that early part of the 20th century when Ashutosh Mukherjee, the father of Shyama Prasad Mukherjee and the first chancellor of Calcutta University, he's not the first maybe, but he's maybe the most well-known and the longest running, brought together so many interesting people, so many Indologists from all over, and philosophers and Indian ones from all over India to come together and discuss these things. And I think that this was Buddhism was around, it was one of the key kinds of issues around which he was able to gather people. And one of the tropes of discussion I did note is that Buddhism didn't disappear. It simply was one of the schools of Hindu thought, and then, of course, this had its own political implications, obviously, but I think that Doug is right there, and I think there's an intuition and an effort to prove this as well, even within the subjects that we're looking at. I think, just to answer something that both of you have really eloquently put out, I think I was surprised. Having done history for so many years, I was well aware that national boundaries are a fiction, they're constructed, they're recent, there's all of that, okay? So great. But the degree of mobility, and circulation, not just things across borders, but people. A colleague here, I was discussing sort of where some of these Tamil ideas about Buddhism were coming from. And our colleague Chandra Bhanu and I were discussing this, and he was saying to me that it's possible that many of these ideas are coming from the coolies who are going over to Burma in the millions in Southeast Asia in this long 19th century and also the 20th century, and bringing some ideas back about, about Buddhist practice. And there's no way to quantify any of these things, but these are just modern circulations. There are so many pre-modern circulations, so many ways to kind of rethink the geography and the circulations, not just around the north, but also the south, and then the north and the south together. I have focused mostly on the Theravada world, and so I call that the Buddhist, across the Buddhist Bay of Bengal, I call it, because I'm able to find material and I'm able to access it and read it that I think is very important to this story. But of course, I've tried to bring in the Japanese and, where possible, the Chinese, but these are sources I can't read. So, but I agree that there must be, and I'm looking forward to your work on this, wonderful kind of, some very interesting circulations there, the kind that even Dalai Lama himself speaks about, that Nehru also picks up on, and so on. So there's that. About the relics, I think that, taking from there, I want to say that I think that this material is showing us a very different South Asia from the one that we usually imagine through our national boundaries, which is a rather obvious point as a historian, and yet to actually flesh it out and then to make sense of both your elite circulations, but also the circulations of ordinary folk. I think that was the challenge, and I think that that's a challenge that should be ongoing for all of us as historians of modern South Asia. Okay, now getting on to the relics, and the relic diplomacy of the current day. So I think, of course, there are definitely there are ties. So there was a phase of relic diplomacy in the 1970s as well, the 50s, the 70s, and then I would say more recently in the last 10 or 15 years, certainly in the last 10 years. And relics again are a kind of modern day way to bring communities, various Buddhist communities across national boundaries together, because relics just are considered to be the most holy of the objects of Buddhism, right? But the 1950s in particular, I don't really tell the whole story. I think there's much more to be said. For instance, China sends Xuanzang's relics and some of his ashes, I believe, to Delhi, and there are pictures of Nehru receiving them at Palam Airport in Safdarjung. I haven't completed the work on this, but there's much more, I think, that's happening. So this little contest between China and India around who has the more valuable Buddhist heritage and more valuable to international diplomacy of various kinds, I think that's also a pretty long-running one. So, and Nehru too, while he is always careful to make this talk about silken bonds of Buddhism, bringing together Buddhist Asia and so on, he is talking about India's contribution. Very much, it's a very nationalist language that he's usually deploying. It's actually Dharmapala's and others who are using a more universalist, slightly softer language, largely because, of course, he's not from India. So there is, he's from Sri Lanka, and that's already considered to be a different colony of the British, even if it's part of, broader South Asia. So he uses a different kind of language. But Nehru's is much more nationalist. And if one was to think about today's Buddhist diplomacy, both in China and India, well, there are shadows of that even 50 years ago. So I would love to hear more, actually, about the Kushok Bakula Rinpoche. I've spoken to you about this earlier, and then I'm really excited to hear about your work on this. I think that he's a fascinating character on which much more needs to be said, because and I know you're going to object to this, but he did, the scholarship that I have read has suggested that he is really the one who brings a certain kind of sense of all of this modern Buddhism that's happening, all this Buddhist revival stuff that's happening in broader South Asia. He's the one who sort of introduces in some way Ladakh to this. Or he pulls Ladakh into that universe, into that cosmopolis, the Buddhist cosmopolis that's emerging. And I think I would love to have done a little bit more in the book with this character, but I ran out of time. But I do, and space. But I do think that is actually a really important intervention that needs to be made at some point. And have I covered everything? China. Yeah, so on the money front, I think that's a really good question. Dharmapala actually tends to, so he has very detailed budgets, and I did try to see, is there a money trail here that suggests something different? I think that Dharmapala is a rich man. He's from an elite family in Colombo, and most of his money continues to come from that funding. At various times it's cut off because the British are very angry with him, and then he's very angry with the British, especially in the 19-teens. From about 1913 till about 1916, he's under house arrest. His brother dies in jail for being part of anti-British protests during the war in Sri Lanka and so on. And he's very angry. So sometime that money is cut off. But he quickly changes that. The relationship changes again when the British suggest to him that you take these relics that we found in Shaji Ki Dera and some other places, and you build a nice monument to it, and that's what he does. So the relationship changes very quickly, but he always remains rather suspicious of them. Now back to the money question, it is an interesting question. Doug has actually looked a little bit into it, especially the Birla funding around some of these things. But for Dharmapala himself, he's making a little bit of money on Buddhist publishing. He's making, and the accounts are there. He's making money on, he's getting some grants from the government. He's making some money on the journal, and then he has all that family money that he's using as well. So on the question of funding, so in every sense, he is an elite person. And as I say, that although their fortunes changed, they're from similar backgrounds, Vivekananda and Dharmapala. Okay, I think more will come to me as, because you had so many comments, more will come to me as, as we continue this discussion. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you for the discussion, everyone. If we have any questions, the floor is open. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for writing this wonderful book. My name is Sanitya. I teach at the law school, and by the accident of birth, I also am Nepalese. I just wanted to ask something about connecting with the Indian exceptionalism thing. That's what you mentioned, quoting Kanak Mani Dixit, who happens to be a journalist whom I hate. In page 4, you mentioned Gitanjali. Just a second. I wish I could ask more interesting questions than these, but I've narrowed down to this. All right, there. Over the last 25, no, sorry, and I quote, over the 25 years after 1947, the modern nation states of India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Maldives, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar emerged out of the ashes of the Indian colony, more or less in brackets, I unquote. So Sikkim and Bhutan, protectorate or not, or princely states or not, was debated-ish, I would agree, but from my recollection, Nepal definitely wasn't a princely state nor a protectorate. So on that line, when you mention this, that they have emerged as modern nation states after 1947 from the ashes of the Indian colony, what exactly did you mean? And depending on what the answer, depending on what your answer would be, I might have a follow-up question of whether the author, by any chance, is a slight victim of the Indian exceptionalism thing, which I have not yet asked.
I'm sure I am. I can straight away say I'm sure I am. No, I didn't, thank you for reading it so closely. You're right. If you want us to go into the exact, and actually while I was writing this line, I was thinking someone is going to catch me on this, and I've been caught. So, but, I didn't mean it in a sense of, the India that is I don't think the India of today is the same as what was 1940s. I meant a broader South Asian region, and perhaps I should have said that. I also thought about it in terms of the broader South Asian region that is under the British Empire, that is in some way or the other indebted or controlled directly by the British Empire. So that's all I meant. But as for this is a relevant question, and it's absolutely right. And just to write this book, I think I've had to overcome a certain India-centricness. There's no doubt about it, and I'm sure that it's still managed to make its way through these pages. So I do agree with you that was actually one of my challenges, and that was also the excitement. So with Nepal, again, I don't think I put in as much as I would like to have, but actually there are wonderful and fascinating circulations between Nepal and India, well, shall we say broader South Asia, on the question of Buddhism. And one character I look at is a person named Dharmaditya Dharmacharya, so I went to the Kathmandu archives, I was telling Swati this morning, and I tried to find more on him. And two scholars of Nepal, well-known scholars of Nepal, have thought of him as the kind of Buddhist reformer. Interestingly, he was quite close to these other reformers who are circulating, who are not just Indian, but from broader South Asia, like Dharmapala, he was associated with the Mahabodhi society and so on. So I think that there's much more to be said even about just the circulations between Nepal and the Indian colony. So I hope that answers your question, gives us a possibility for a future discussion.
One question. I don't know how related is it to the book, but I just wanted to know what's the relevance of Buddhism in India of 2024.
Should I read the entire book too? I'm kidding. I still think Buddhism is all around us, especially some of the legacies of these ideas that some of these people came up with. Just to mention things that Swati and Hindol have picked up on, just at the state level, your Buddhist diplomacy, but also kind of backing of Buddhist statues and Buddhist institutions. I mean, there are many state institutions of Buddhist learning and so on, state-supported institutions that came up in the 50s that are still very much on the books. Maybe on a broader level, you could think about Nalanda University as well, not doing too well now, but it was meant to be a kind of joint Asian collaboration to revive Nalanda University in Nalanda in Bihar as the last Buddhist university in India, etc. With regard to Buddhist conversion, well, you have millions of Buddhists now in India, not just, of course, in the Himalayan regions, but also among Dalits. And I think that's a very significant conversion and there are very significant political and spiritual presence on the subcontinent. I won't say only political, because there is also a very strong spiritual side to this. And so there's that. At another level, just connected to that, you have Mayawati's parks for social change, Dalit Prerna Sthals, etc., around UP. And if you go into Delhi and you go from Delhi to Noida, if you go from here to Noida, you will have to pass the park, right? And that park has its own Dalit and Buddhist genealogy. So that's around us. You see statues of Ambedkar everywhere. Dalits, his conversion day is celebrated. Beyond that, you have Soka Gakkai. You have all kinds of middle-class practices and upper-class practices of Buddhism as well. With relevance, well, that's... The Dalai Lama lives here, and you have a huge Tibetan community in exile, the government in exile here. You still have a fair bit of border crossing from what I hear. With regard to relevance, well, I think all of these different groups are keeping Buddhism relevant, for their own reasons, their own projects, political, social, cultural, community-oriented. And so I think that you just scratch a little bit and you'll find, your answer. I think it's still very much around at all levels, state. Vipassana, absolutely. Yes, these were the reasons why I got into this study to begin with. Is actually, if you look around, there's a lot of Buddhism and Buddhist adjacent and Buddhist influenced stuff, material as well as practices, as well as, and at the state level, the social level, the community level, the regional level. For instance, Catherine Becker has this wonderful book on Buddhist iconography in Andhra Pradesh and how much Andhra Pradesh harks back to its Buddhist heritage. Of course, we know about Amravati as being, a potential capital and so on, that's got its Buddhist heritage. So, and of course, N.T. Rama Rao, the late president of TDP, inaugurated that huge Buddha Sagar lake in Hyderabad, if I recall, right? The Dalai Lama consecrated. Just the fact that the Dalai Lama is in lots of Buddhist places where no Dalai Lama has ever been before, and doing Kal Chakra and doing the various Tibetan rituals, is itself telling you that the relevance of Buddhism hasn't gone anywhere, except that it's still a multifarious, it's still a very diverse project, and the different projects on these different groups. So that would require a different study.
Thank you.
I think since 2021, the Prime Minister has gone on record to suggest that the ideas of Buddha is one of the primary factors of the draft of the constitutional values. And of course, there has been a lot of other people working on it in terms of how Buddha may have inspired the values of the preamble. I'm not suggesting that's your work or that's, and because it's 75 years of the Constitution, everybody's speaking about it, including in-house. So I just wanted to check with you, in your research, is there, because there is a lot of contestation to that idea, because for example, even if our emblems are picked up from Buddhist icons, the way they have been interpreted by various political parties is dramatically differently than what they were meant to be. Many of the ideas of peace is not necessarily related to Buddha, rather through Gandhi's inspiration of other sources. Is it really just a way of saying that Buddha inspired some of the ideas of the Constitution, or do you think there is any merit to that statement?
Well, I don't think the Buddha in his own time was thinking about constitutions. So there is that. Although he was thinking about state-society relations, I suppose. And if the constitution is in some ways a representative of that, I guess he was thinking about constitutions. I'm thinking out loud because I haven't thought about this question before. But there is a lot of mention of the Buddha in the Constituent Assembly. And there's just so much discussion. And a lot of it feels facetious, and yet it's representative of a certain kind of place that the Buddha and Buddhism occupy, I think, in general public discourse. So for instance, Sarojini Nagar is saying, oh, Rajendra Prasad, you are, oh, I'm so sorry, Sarojini Nagar, did I say? I'm sorry, Sarojini Naidu. Sarojini Naidu, thanks for correcting me. Sarojini Naidu says, Sorry, yeah, there is, that's right. So Sarojini Naidu says, well, Rajendra Prasad is the president of this assembly, and he comes from the land of the Buddha, and therefore he's taken a lot of the Buddha's, personality traits like calmness, and she makes, and then there's a joke and all that. And then there's a lot of mention and talk about Buddhism, everything from this kind of sort of more facetious joke to more serious matters as well. But interestingly, Nehru, when he floats that resolution for the emblems, especially it's a national flag resolution in July 1947, he never once mentions Buddhism in that entire speech. He only mentions Ashoka. I think that in a way, maybe by the time, by the early 50s, when there's a lot of active discussion, especially by Ambedkar and other Buddhist activists, about what Buddhism can lend democracy, I think that there is an effort to try and say that democracy can't survive without Buddhism. But that still isn't the same thing as saying that the preamble is inspired by Buddhism. I think that's just taking it a little far. But there are ideas in the air about how to bring these two together. And there's some effort even to say that, in fact, the Buddha was the first democrat and so on. But this is, this is the object of study. It can't be taken as the actual truth, I think. So thanks for the question. And I'll have to think a little bit more about it. But I hope I've given you some type of answer. Yeah, Jared.
Thanks a lot. I am Naresh Singh. I'm with the School of Government and Public Policy. I really enjoyed reading your book. I have one or two quick comments. I just wanted to pick up on the question about the relevance in the 2024, and I, in fact, want to look at the relevance beyond 2024, maybe to 2047. I want to echo maybe Rabbi Michael Lerner in the US, who raised a question in his book called Revolutionary Love. He said, what would public policy look like in the United States if the objective of that policy was greater love and harmony in the United States? So echoing him, my question then, when one looks at Buddhist ideals of karuna and maitri, compassion, love, harmony, interbeing, nonviolence, all of those values, the question, anti-casteism, perhaps most important for India, the question might be, what would public policy look like in India? And what should democracy look like in India if it would reflect these values? I think that debate should be really important, not only in India, but in today's world, because these values, I would argue, are critically important in governance and public policy in today's world. And your book might reinforce the basis on which that might be done. I'm thinking even of the criteria that we use in measuring progress towards 2047. If the criteria will only be GDP per capita, we will be in big trouble. So if India is indeed the debate about whether, Buddhism is Indian or South Asian or global, even if we take a little bit of the ownership or we take a little bit just of our own legacy and infuse that in the criteria we use to measure progress, indeed, in declaring and defining the vision of 2047, I think that will go a far way. The next point that occurs to me is when we talk of spiritualized democracy, I think that's really an important concept in today's world because it must go beyond, I don't know what's the right word, but if I struggle, I might say religious democracy. I wanted to make a kind of a nice adjective of that word, but it's difficult to say religiousized democracy. But spiritualized democracy might lead us above the level of over-religious democracy. And I think, I've asked that question to a spiritual teacher in this country, whether India was too religious to be spiritual. And I was surprised when he answered yes. That is a big challenge, and maybe the legacy and history of Buddhism has something to offer. And finally, in terms of legacy, ownership, and where it is today, if India were to take its legacy seriously and its current geopolitical credibility, it could lead the world, drawing from Buddhist values, as we just talked about. It could lead the world on a trajectory to what the world is struggling to achieve, including things like sustainable development goals, greater peace and security, and all of those things. So those would be my kind of answers to the question that was raised earlier of the contemporary value and the 2024 and moving on to 2047. But your book, as you know, you and I have talked a bit about these things. I really enjoyed reading it. Congratulations on the book. And I do think it has, as I've outlined, a lot of importance now.
Thank you. So I don't think I can really respond to that. See, the nice thing is sometimes one can actually hide behind the thing that one is a historian, and therefore we look at the past. We're very bad at predicting the future and feel quite fearful of it. But I think that all the things that you're saying were precisely the kinds of things that were going through some minds in the 40s and the 50s, was how do we make this heritage of Buddhism relevant to, and so there is an inventiveness to some of this, it's not as though Buddhism always existed and was just, it's also being structured in a way that it speaks to whatever the needs were of that time, whether it be of constitution or democracy. And actually the spiritualized democracy comment that Dharmapala makes is a very old one. He makes it in the 1890s. So at that point, there's already this thinking that the democracy is important, but if it's without this spiritual side of things, however he conceived of that, then it will be a democracy that will be without values, progressive values, whatever that means at that point, right? So, and this is an idea, the spiritualized democracy idea, I think for the next 70, 80 years is being discussed in quite a bit of detail.
But I would like to raise a question, reading from Ambedkar again. Professor Hindol, time and again asking one question that actually strikes me so much. It is about who owns Buddhism, how one can own Buddhism. That actually take me to read Ambedkar's this volume called third volume, which is about Indian philosophy. Buddhism in Indian history, India's history is nothing but the fight between Brahmanism and Buddhism. So one would really skeptical and really doubtful about how Buddhism declined in India. Who are the people responsible for declining of Buddhism? And today there is a time that everybody are coming into a place that how to appropriate or how to own Buddhism, and really we forget the history that how Buddhism struggle to alive themselves, whether it is stupa or temples, Bihar or anybody. I come from a state, Odisha, full of Buddhism. The last part of Buddhism actually survived in Odisha. So this is called Ratnagiri, Udayagiri, and many other. So, and last year I visited, just to give an example to this. Last year I visited this place. It is horrible. Believe me, it is horrible. It is actually taken by Archaeological Survey of India, but full of evidence, full of monuments and so on. But who is interested to take care of it, right? So therefore, in what sense really we are interested to own Buddhism, where it could be as what you said, it could be part of policy, it could be part of environmental justice and many other things. And in a way that how one would read, coming to your book, how one would read Indian history per se, right? And picking up many other thinkers that you have dealt with. And how this thinker also in a way appropriated Buddhism in their own way to think about India. One would definitely think about justice, peace, morality and so on. Really are we depart from these all values? So that is a question, are we really departing this value, appropriating Buddhism? I would not hesitate to contrast this example when Savarkar would appropriate Buddhism. It is, he would not see any goodness in Buddhism which can teach, good to the whole society. So in that sense, one also to be very much, aware and, aware about the history, how it is appropriated. Just a point to maybe a comments or maybe something I would like to know, that the title of book is really catchy. It is very good, title, Democracy is Dhamma. 2-3 times you refer that you don't like to call, when Ambedkar's or anti-caste are taking, Buddhism as a political. But why didn't you see in terms of, a philosophy, in terms of a philosophy that could, that could be a philosophy of India, not in an essentialized way, but a philosophy that could, gives you moral values. And moral values for Buddha and even Ambedkarite and anti-caste are really, really important. So through moral values, one can really question the Brahminical values. So that's the point.
Jadu, you have to read my chapter. I make the argument, of course, that there's a political community that comes after the conversion. But I don't by any means argue that there is no philosophy, there is no actual spirit. There are matters of the spirit involved. There's an ethical code involved. There's a lot. This is a gigantic enterprise, which is an unfinished one. And there are critics of it and so on. I also talk about some of the contradictions in those criticisms of Ambedkar's especially the book, the Buddha and the Dhamma, but also of the conversion and the classism, the elitism in some of those critiques. I think that Ambedkar himself says after the conversion that this is an attempt to convert. It's not that the conversion has to stop with Dalits. It has to be a conversion of all of India. I also think there's a practical side to it. I think he was looking for something like a Bahujan front as well. He was working on that a little bit before he died. And that remained an unfinished exercise. But I do not see why. I'm not one of those people who thinks that the politics, the philosophy, and the ethics and that these things are strictly separate. Not at all. I don't consider this. It's just that for the first time there are real numbers, which in our democracy numbers are important. There are real numbers here that are empowered by this conversion, and just the mere fact that he now makes everybody their own priest. They can convert, any Dalit can convert any other Dalit, right? Just this is itself its own revolutionary act, right? And I think that it has that, there is a certain grandness to that purpose of it, whatever the outcome. And there is this philosophical attack that, everyone is now going to be their own priest. So I've talked about all of that as well. I'm sorry if that didn't come through in my presentation, but I would really invite a longer discussion after you've read it. Thank you.
In the years leading up to Indian independence, religious identities became extremely important for Hindus and Muslims for articulating nationalism and community identities. So what form did Buddhist identity formation take during this period, and how important was that in the endorsement that it received from our political leaders post-independence? I also have a second question, but I think that depends on how you answer the first. How important was the political identity formation of Buddhism important to the British in navigating the colonial regime?
Gating what?
Navigating the colonial regime.
Oh, okay. Yeah, shall we just take, let's have Renu's question too. I'll come back to you, Mansi.
I just wanted to add to what Jatu was asking, but in a different sense, to go back to the history of Buddhism in South Asia or the Indian Ocean. So I was thinking that there is this decline of Buddhism, if you have to use the word decline. In India or in many other parts of the Indian Ocean, you can see especially Buddhist thalassocracies converting to Islam, for instance. Mm-hmm. And even in maritime India, you'll see a lot of conversions, happening to Islam. And there's a general decline of Buddhism, not just because of Islam, but also for other reasons, you can see. And Sri Lanka is, an example where it continues in some ways. So some of the things that you're talking about, Buddhist diplomacy or, exchange of artifacts as gifts, in a diplomatic context, all these things are happening in Sri Lanka, for instance. I can't think of other states where,
Burma
you know,
as well.
Buddhist, Burma as well.
Thailand,
Yeah.
Siam.
Yeah. But Indonesia is converted to Islam,
Islam.
from being a Buddhist thalassocracy.
Yeah, yeah.
So when you 19th century, what exactly is happening? Because in some parts it could be a continuity from the previous eras, right? Kind of political Buddhism. You talked about anti-colonial Buddhism as well, like very similar to anti-colonial Islam in India, for instance. So that political Islam, right? So what exactly is this 19th century moment, the colonial moment in which this revival of Buddhism is happening in many parts of the Indian Ocean? I don't know if Swati or somebody was talking about the colonial discovery of Buddhism, was it?
And that was me, yeah.
Yeah. So what happens in the 19th century that, this kind
That
of,
changes it, yeah. So I'll just start with Mansi's question. Thank you for wonderful questions. So this is a great question, and it's a really relevant one too. That what is different about Buddhism at this point from Hinduism and Islam, which are also emerging as very politicized identities more than anything else. And the fact is that it doesn't have a large following. It just doesn't have that community, and because it doesn't have that community, it's not really figuring within these very political discussions about majority, minority, future rule. It doesn't have that kind of political leadership either. And that's why I say that political community, the numbers come after 1956. So what happens is Buddhism emerges as this kind of box into which a lot of good things, including utopian thinking, your idea of the future, what a wonderful future can look like, matters of the spirit. Buddhism also, really in the theosophical era in the late 19th century, had already emerged as something that is more of a philosophy than religion, something you still hear very often now. And one that then the point is, it's not tainted, quote unquote, by the problems of kind of a violent or very exclusive religious identity. In India, anyway, it is in Burma and in Sri Lanka, right? So hence that genocidal violence there later. So that's why Nehru, who is such an avowed, he's so anti-religion in so many ways. And he gets irritated with Gandhi for being, too religious and using too much religious imagery and so on. And obviously has witnessed partition, obviously had to deal with Jinnah, all of that, right? He seems to be so drawn to Buddhism in a really substantial kind of way. And he can be because, it just hasn't taken on that kind of political color at this point at all. So that's to answer that question. Did I need to answer the second one now? Okay, so can you just repeat it? The political decline, what?
Yeah, so I was just curious to know that, depending on whatever identity formation was happening within the Buddhist community, how important was it for the British to address these questions while navigating the colonial regime? Because when the British were in India, they already had some conceptions about what Hinduism should look like, what Islam should look like, and they were writing about it in a lot of detail, and that did dictate how they were addressing colonial questions, at least.
They also had an idea of what Buddhism should look like, even more so, I think, than anything else. And Buddhism was kind of as much their baby as anybody else's, right? So the 19th century sees this kind of British discovery of Buddhism, which is happening in the colonial context, and it's not important just in India, it's really important to their public discourse in England, in London. London is full of all these discussions. Partly, it's been interpreted by scholars as anti-church, as like an anti-church maneuver. It's partly also that, well, now we have this enormous empire and we have all these wonderful ideas that can challenge the power of the church. People are disillusioned by the church, the Protestant church, Catholic church in various ways in the 19th century. So Buddhism is emerging that way. But the British don't have anyone beyond a point to negotiate with. That said, they are constantly engaging with political Buddhists, Buddhist communities in the Himalaya. I'm sure Swati can say more about this, but just to give a little example, for instance, there are complaints against the Kashmir Raja in the 1930s, and a British commission is put together to try and figure out how, better representation of various communities within the Raja's court, how to sort of settle this disaffection of the population. And they have representation from Ladakh as well. And they're ignoring it to a certain degree because it's not politically, there is a sense of a political center and a mainstream, and Ladakh is not seen as part of that. But that said, there are petitions coming from Burma and from Sri Lanka saying you need to help our Buddhist brethren in Ladakh. Telling the British this. So there is, there's that, but that's not enough actually to move the. They are, of course, concerned by what's happening in Burma, but Burma for them is a little separate issue from what's happening in India. Does that answer that question? Okay. Back to this, to Renu's, again, very interesting question. So I think that much of what is happening in the 19th century is happening on a different scale. But, Anne Blackburn, Charles Hallisey, they've all shown that there is a tremendous Buddhist, arena of exchange that's happening earlier. So there are these conversions, but then the Burmese court is also coming up with these new ideas of universal kingship, which are, and the Sasana, and they're in conversation with the Siam kings sometimes. Sometimes they're in conversation with what's happening in the Kandyan kings in Sri Lanka. And so there is already that exchange going on. In fact, the British insert themselves into that, and there's archival evidence to show that their manuscripts still making the move, except that now they have to take British permission to do so. And so that is made itself into those records. But actually, there is a prolific, especially around the Bay of Bengal, I would say, probably elsewhere, but my sources are really in that arena of Theravada Buddhism. And this Buddhism is, of course, being transformed. But the colonial intervention is important. So while this doesn't put the colonials at the center of the story, the colonial intervention, I think, is very important, both in terms of scholarship, in terms of archaeology, in terms of governing these populations, in terms of the transport revolution, publishing revolution, all the things that are now happening on a much larger scale at the end of the 19th century than they have ever happened before. And I think because the scale changes, and because all of this is happening within colonies or areas within the British Empire, largely, except for Siam, of course, there is a way in which they're mediating some of those exchanges, but also some of that traveling and so on becomes easier. And so there's much more exchange happening than perhaps ever before. But this is not to say that there wasn't prolific exchange, prolific by the standards of the time, before as well. I think it's just that the scale changes. Therefore, the motivations and end goals and outcomes change in the 19th century.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all the questions. I would now once again like to thank everyone for taking out the time and joining today's session, especially Professor Dr. Dennis, Dean JSLL, along with the other faculty members across JGU who have taken out time to join this discussion. It was a very insightful and enriching session and discussion, especially for me because I learned a lot of new things. So I look forward to reading the entire book, ma'am, and once again, congratulations for the same. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you all for coming.